director of the library. And for your live audience, so we have over 300 people coming in via Zoom. So those of you who are watching via Zoom, am I good?
Yeah.
Okay. So those of you who are in via Zoom, we are recording this. You're going to be muted throughout this whole talk, and you won't be able to turn your camera on. You'll be able to see, but we won't be able to see you. We are recording it in two ways. It'll be on the Cornwall Association website and on the library website. And you will be able to use the chat feature because towards the end of the talk we'll have a few minutes for questions and answers. So as I mentioned, this event is being held in conjunction with the Cornwall Association. So I'd like to welcome Michelle Schiff from that group to introduce our speaker.
Thank you. I'm so happy that you're all here in person and Zoom. The best thing is that we can spend tonight and learn how to be better bear neighbors. So tonight we have Kyle Kesterman here from DEEP, a wildlife specialist. He's been with DEEP since about 2015, working not only with bears but other animals out there. I have had the pleasure to already see Kyle's presentation, and I feel so lucky that he's here to do this with us. So I'm going to turn it over to Kyle. If you have questions, just note them down. We'll have a short question and answer period later, as Margaret said. So Kyle, thank you.
Thank you. All right. Well, thank you all for attending here in person. This is my first in-person presentation in a while, so I'm glad to be here. I'm going to start with just a little bit of So I've given this a similar talk to like this before. I'd like to start off with a couple questions. I'm assuming most of you at this point live west of the Connecticut River here. Is everybody here from Cornwall? Anybody from a different town?
Nearby.
Nearby, Torrington? All right, great. So online, I don't know where you're all from, but most people attending these often are from the western part of Connecticut. Another thing I'd like to find out is if you see bears regularly. So raise your hands, my live audience, if you see bears regularly, if you would consider that. All right. Just about everybody. Has everybody seen a bear before? Or anybody not seen a bear in Connecticut in the wild? All right, good. So you'll have some experience with black bears. I'm going to cover a few things today. I'm going to briefly cover kind of the basics of ecology and natural history. There's a lot of information about black bears available online, not only on our DEEP website, but just for black bears in general, since they range across the country from Mexico all the way up into the Arctic, east coast to west coast. So there's a lot of information you can find about those ecology and natural history there. So what I'm going to focus more on today is how the Wildlife Division studies and manages black bears. Ways that you can prevent and resolve conflicts, and really work on trying to separate some of the fact and fiction and the most common misconceptions people have about black bears in Connecticut. So the public's perception of bears and the DEP, it spans really two big extremes. And maybe you're coming from one perspective and you're going to see and you hear people talk about it on from the other perspective. And you know, from DEEP wants to annihilate the bears to DEEP won't do anything to help us, you know, deal with the bears. Don't report bears to DEEP, they're just going to come and kill it. Or the state cares more about these animals than they do our public safety. So these two extremes, we often see that in the Facebook comments, one way or the other, or news articles are written with one emphasis in mind or something. So big extremes, and it's hard to differentiate fact and fiction in those pieces. And there's a lot that's missing without the context or without knowing the whole situation for any individual bear incident that might happen or someone's individual experience with a bear. And so in reality, DEEP is a government agency, there's biologists, there's lawmakers, we're working with what the possible actions that DEEP can take, where our scope of work is in this very much more narrow margin. So we really can never be one way or the other. Where we work is kind of in the middle here, guided by science and our laws. And depending on the individual situation, that might be occurring, our actions that we take are going to be guided by our policies that we have as a government organization, and then guided, which those hopefully are guided by science. So, I just got a little graphic just showing, depending on the circumstance, the situation, all these different things, we have a very much more narrower scope of what we can actually do. It's not on these extremes one way or the other. So, a little bit with the black bears, categories of bears, when I'm going to refer to them in different ways. Cubs, when we talk about bear cubs, we're talking about bears that are just born, they're a few months old. By the time they get close to that second winter, or that first winter as being, bears that are able to move on their own, to around 2-ish, we call them yearlings. And sows are adult females, those are typically breeding females, and male bears are called boars. So even these, so we've got 3 cubs on the tree. Those are actually some cubs with the mother still. They're a little bit older. They're not quite yearlings yet. And then we have the big boar. How big do black bears get? Well, when they start off, they are very tiny. They are only about the size of a soda can in weight and volume. They have a very short active gestation period inside the mother, and they grow very fast. The cub here that I'm holding is already maybe 4 or 5 weeks old. It's already quite large. It's grown quite a bit from its mother's milk. And then on the far end of the extreme, we have a boar that's probably the size of a lawn tractor here. So they grow pretty big, especially where they have a lot of food, and the males don't have to deal with pregnancy and all that stuff, so whatever they eat in the mild winter, they don't burn through it as much during their denning period. So what do bears eat? Well, in the spring, one of the most important foods for bears is skunk cabbage. It's one of the first greens to come up. So you'll often find bears in wetlands in the spring, waiting for that vegetation to spring up elsewhere. They eat insect larvae, lots of insects. So the paper wasp nest here, they're not necessarily going after honey. They're going to find wasp larvae all over. They certainly won't turn down honey, though, if they find a honeybee nest or hives. They'll also eat berries of wherever they can find them, viburnums, obviously blueberries, strawberries. Berries are a good source of a lot of moisture and nutrient for them. But by far the most important natural food for a bear throughout the year comes in the fall, typically in the fall, and that's in the form of hard mast. So mostly acorns, beech nuts, hickory nuts, those hard mast. That provides a lot of calories for the bears as they're trying to build up their fat reserves for the winter. So hard mast is one of the most important things for bears over the whole year. Is that all that bears eat? Have you seen bears eating something other than that? Okay. All right, they're eating bird food of various kinds, suet, black oil sunflower seeds, hummingbird nectar, all kinds of other bird seed, and they're eating things in our trash. But how do bears find all that food? Well, they have probably the best sense of smell in the animal kingdom. Some of these things are hard to really quantify, but their sense of smell is 100 times better than ours. They have a bigger sensory, parts of their brain that are responsible for smell. Theirs are much larger in proportion to ours. They're 10 times better than the best dogs as well. They can smell things over a mile away. And they can travel miles and miles every day. So if they can smell it, they have the power to follow it and find that garbage, to find that birdseed that day. So they're on the move all the time looking for food. They're just big eating machines. Fortunately, like I said, almost all that they're eating is vegetation. The animal matter that they're eating is coming from the insects, also coming from some carrion, roadkill, things like that, scavenging stuff. If they find a rabbit nest or something. So that's predominantly what they're eating. Where do they find all that? Well, they find it where they live, and that's where they find suitable habitat. Habitat for any animal, including us. We need food, water, shelter, and space. Those are the 4 requirements. So you might think to yourself how you might find those requirements in your life, where you find those around you, and it might be different than someone else, their preferences for the type of environment that they live in. For bears, making sure they have enough food, making sure there's water, shelter for them, and space. So you might have a very densely packed area with people's homes and everything, where maybe they're going to find the food, but not the water, shelter, and space. But if it's adjacent to a nice forest where there is the other requirements, then even though it might be surprising to find a bear in your neighborhood with birdseed or something, the remaining requirements for that habitat are near enough for them that the whole area would be suitable for them. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. I'm going to break down kind of the bear seasons into two broad categories just for simplicity here. The first one I'll talk about is the breeding season, and that takes place kind of in early summer, late spring. The females mate every other year because they keep their young with them typically for a full year and a half or so through their cubs' second winter. They're born in their first winter through the second winter, typically. But the males will seek to mate every year because there's going to be some female that's available on that year rotation. Cubs do grow quickly. They gain independence pretty quickly. Around here we have great habitat. There's a lot of food for them. There's not a lot of threats to them. So they grow quickly and they can be independent very fast. They don't need that whole year and a half to become independent. And often when they're denning in that winter, I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, they're pretty independent even in denning. You might see the boars following the females, the sows around during that breeding time, waiting for the female to come into her most fertile period and hoping that she's receptive to him. So during early June, late May, you might find two adult bears wandering around together, one being much bigger than the other. That would be the male following the female around, waiting for an opportunity to mate. Bears are among about 100 other mammal species that go through delayed implantation. And what that means is that the female's eggs will be fertilized during the mating period, but then they'll go into a state of diapause. So the zygote will stop developing, they'll divide a few times and then stop. It won't implant into the female's uterus. It'll wait until the fall after she's gained enough weight before it actually implants and active pregnancy actually occurs. So it's a very short period of time. A lot of animals that do this tend to do this as a way to make sure the mother is going to be healthy enough, has eaten enough before the period of the winter, and to time the birth of the cubs so that it comes while she's in her den. That denning season takes place between December and March, and just before all that is the time that we call hyperphagia, or big eating. And that's when that hard mass is really, really important for them. That's when they're going to go around looking to probably eat 20,000 or more calories every day, so they're going to try to gain a lot of weight. When they do end up denning, we don't really call it hibernation. Hibernation tends to be a much deeper period of torpor, where the body temperature declines to near ambient or the environment around them. Bears, because they're much bigger and they need to reactivate themselves quickly if there's a threat or something, they don't drop their temperatures quite as much. They can still be woken up, but it's kind of that balance of, for a small animal, the cost to re-warm back to normal body temperature if you're a very small bat isn't going to cost very much. But if you're a 300-pound bear, the cost of warming up a 300-pound body from being in the refrigerator to our normal temperature is going to cost a lot of energy. So bears find that balance of being able to save energy by reducing their body temperature by about 10 degrees or so, and that'll save them a lot of energy through the winter. The cubs are born in the den, like I mentioned, only after a few weeks of gestation. They're about the size of the soda can, and the following year, those yearlings will likely den with the mother or nearby the mother. But the thing to think about in the winter, around here, especially as our winters tend to be pretty mild, is that bears can be active at any time of year. So raise your hands if you've seen a bear in the winter. A bunch of you have, okay. If you're in a more developed area, like maybe Simsbury or something where there's a lot of bird feeders in a very dense area, you probably have seen more bears in the winter than two. Because they can be active at any time. If it's a warm spell, why does the bear need to stay in its den when there's some food around? Or if there's not snow cover, then there's likely still food available, the hard mass is still on the ground. Briefly, getting into the history of bears in Connecticut, they're a native species. So they were here present before colonization. So after the last period of glaciation, so for about the last 10 or so thousand years, black bears hadn't been here. Only for, say, 100 150 years or so of that time were they not here. They were hunted, and generally because of habitat loss, they were extirpated from the state in the 1800s. That history of extirpation due to habitat loss is pretty well known in Connecticut. A lot of animals were displaced in Connecticut, and some have come back, like black bears, fisher, things like that. When they started to come back into Connecticut, it was because we had the habitat for them. We started to get reports of black bears returning in Connecticut from the northwest corner in the 1980s, and those reports increased throughout the 90s. It wasn't until, though, the late 90s that we started to actually get reports of sows with offspring, mostly along the border towns. And when you find sows with offspring, it likely means that that reproduction happened because they're born in that area where they were seen. They don't travel very far. They're not traveling across state lines, across tens and hundreds of miles like a young bear might. So if you see cubs, they were probably born in that general area. And that was the first indication that Connecticut now had a reproducing population of black bears. Often these sightings that you're seeing in the far off reaches of the state, especially during the early times, those were young wandering male bears who have dispersed and are looking for a territory, looking for habitat. And so, like you see, you get relatively few reports across the state, but still mostly in the Northwest. Now, 20-something years later from that last map, 30 plus years after the first bear started to return, we're seeing continued expansion of the black bear range. Generally, we can say that population is continuing to grow. We're seeing signs of things like more roadkill in more places, so bears are being hit by vehicles more often and across a larger geographic area of the state. So they're expanding out more. We're also getting more conflicts reported to us. So people are reporting when they're having issues with bears, and we're getting more conflicts every year across more of the state. So there needs to be more, it showed the need for increasing management of the species. And these aren't numbers of black bears, these are just reports from the public about black bears. And it's not an exact science, but you can kind of see a trend that the majority of the reports come from the western half of the state, and there are fewer in the eastern half, but they're still there. So I mentioned as we started to have more and more bears, that showed the need for more and more management. And what do I mean by management? Well, I'm talking about wildlife management. And what that is briefly, it's managing kind of the interactions between humans, wildlife, and their habitats, all kind of within the environment. And often the goals of wildlife managers is to maintain or increase the native biodiversity of an area. That's kind of our job. That's why we have laws that dictate that wildlife biologists work to achieve those goals. Each species might have species-specific goals, but broadly there's a couple different styles of management, and they're going to depend on a lot of different factors. But we have manipulative and custodial management. The difference between manipulative and custodial really is custodial is looking to limit any external inputs. Manipulative is doing something where you're providing some inputs into it. What do I mean by that? Custodial is something like trying to keep people from feeding bears in national parks. You're trying to prevent some extra inputs. So that's custodial, keeping people away from bears. Manipulative is doing something to manage the environment or manage the species and to some effect. So to do all that, a manager has a toolbox. Not necessarily a literal toolbox, but we do have literal toolboxes that have tools in them for stuff. But it's going to depend on the species that you're working with. You can imagine managing a rare species of bird is going to be different than managing a fish, and managing black bears. But it's going to be some of the most important tools that we use as wildlife managers are research. So we have to conduct research. That's how we make our informed decisions. We can use hunting and trapping as a way to help us reach population goals. We can use education as a way to raise the public's awareness so they can coexist better, be more aware of them. And then we can do things to actually manage conflict with bears, in particular with bears, but all that's going to be better for the animals and the humans. And then we can do things like manage the land to better suit certain species. So that's kind of broad, for multiple species, and we can get into the particulars for bears in a minute here. One other important concept that's important for everybody, I think, in the public to understand with wildlife in general, and especially bears, is these two concepts of carrying capacity. So I don't mean to throw you into biology class, and I think you'll be able to understand the difference between these two. Biological carrying capacity is the maximum number of individuals that can persist indefinitely in an area. And it's going to be dependent on all kinds of different inputs of what the most number of individuals that can live in an area indefinitely. The cultural carrying capacity, though, is the maximum number of individuals that the human population will tolerate in the area. And the good example I like to use, I think, is the biological carrying capacity of mice in your basement or in your house in general is probably pretty high. Mice, if they could get in, your basement or your home could support a lot of mice. The cultural carrying capacity of those mice, though, from you, how many mice could you tolerate in your house? Far fewer, far less than the biological carrying capacity. So that's something that we have to kind of understand for any species that we're managing, the difference between those two, what the biological carrying capacity is and what the cultural carrying capacity is. And none of those are fixed. So as the habitat changes, as the public's perception of things changes, as anything can affect and change the levels of those carrying capacities over time. So I'm going to ask you guys here, my live audience, a question. You're going to raise your hands if you think black bears in Connecticut are overpopulated. If they're over their carrying capacity, raise your hand. So I got one, okay. If you think they're at, like there is like, this is the maximum number of bears that we can have without them being overpopulated, raise your hand. Okay, correct carrying capacity for a couple. And then if we have not yet reached biological carrying capacity. All right, most of you think we're there. So that tells me a little about the audience too that I was speaking to here. Because again, you look on some of the social media sites and all those places, you see very different types of comments. And how can you guys make more informed decisions? So trying to provide that for you here with this talk of where we are and how do we know these things. I'm going to answer this question for you as we go along. Those key components of wildlife management, it's going to depend on specific goals and objectives that you might have. You have to create a management plan. Almost all of the wildlife that we have in Connecticut has its own management plan or is a part of a broader management plan. And a couple of those things that we might be managing for. We might manage a population to stay within its carrying capacity. An example of that would be deer. So deer have, for decades, have been overshooting their carrying capacity in Connecticut, causing detrimental effects to the habitat and to their own population in some areas where they're over-browsing and their health is not doing well. So we manage deer. We have hunting seasons to help the deer population stay within its carrying capacity so that they don't overshoot and have sort of starvation events, which, you know, in smaller areas like on Bluff Point, deer were very overpopulated in that area and they were severely emaciated. So that can happen, and you see the effects of their browsing in your backyard. Does anybody have deer that browse through your garden and all kinds of stuff? Right, the good stuff. So the other thing we can do is manage habitat to maintain or increase carrying capacity. An example of that would be the New England cottontails, which are in this part of the state here. The limiting factor for cottontails is habitat. So if you increase the amount of available habitat around the range of cottontails, the population will likely increase. So we can also, those are kind of the two heavy-handed things. We can manage the population or we can manage the habitat. We can also recommend policy changes to achieve certain goals too. An example of that for bears might be recommending and guiding policy for feeding ordinances that might reduce conflicts. And a lot of that requires expertise and inputs from not just biologists, but other people around in the public. So all that requires a lot of expertise to effectively manage those things together. One of the questions that we get asked the most is, how many bears are there? All right, so we get asked that all the time whenever there's a news outlet or anybody asking, how many bears are there? And you know, sometimes we don't have a great answer because it's really not the most useful metric for a biologist to know. A couple of reasons why. They are time and labor intensive. It takes a long time to collect data just to get one number that doesn't necessarily tell you anything else about the population. UConn and the Wildlife Division worked together back in the early part of the 2013, 2014 timeframe, and were able to get an estimate. It took several years of planning, execution, a lot of money, a lot of field work to get a genetic to collect genetic samples to actually get an estimate of how many bears were in the state and to estimate densities in certain areas. In this study, they used, they sort of created some barbed wire corrals around trees and had some scent, and so the bears had to rub it and they would lose a little bit of hair, and then they would genetically sample those hairs to figure out roughly how many individuals were in the area. At the time, so this is around 2014, they estimated that there were about 800 bears in the state, including juveniles. At this point, though, with some of what we know about population growth, we're estimating it's probably around 1,200. But again, it's not the most informative piece of data, because the next year, everyone's going to ask, okay, what is it now? And it took several years to get those estimates. And what does it necessarily tell you in general? Not much. So instead, what we use is a population index. And you can think of a population index kind of like a stock index. It has a number of different metrics or companies in that case. Their performance can increase and decrease over time, but we're sort of tracking a broader index of the population and how it's behaving. One of those things we might track is the range expansion. Are they being encountered in more places? What is the species' survival? So how long are they living? What factors are affecting their mortality? What is the likelihood that a first-year bear will survive into the next year? How many vehicle strikes are we seeing? And then also information about their individual biology. So how old are the bears when they first reproduce? Is it young? Does it take 5 or 10 years for the species to reproduce successfully? Also, how big are their litter sizes? So all those things you can see can factor into an idea about how the population is maybe behaving. You might have some things going up, some things leveling out, some things going down, but overall we might be saying, okay, the population is likely still expanding and in need of management. Conflicts are another thing that we keep track of in this index. What causes them? What the best ways do we find to prevent them? So this is really what we spend our time trying to manage, trying to figure out is these factors that go into an index like this. And we use a number of different research methods to do this. So we use a couple different things. Yes, it's interesting that you have a population estimate. It can be useful if it's a piece of useful information, but it's certainly not the end-all be-all for us. We use public sightings to help us collect some information about this. We do some live trapping, and we do telemetry. That means kind of like the radio telemetry with the antennas. We do den visits, so we visit where the black bear females are denning with their offsprings to learn about those things. And then we do necropsies on dead bears, roadkill bears that we get in. We'll study them to learn more about it. I'm going to detail each one of those in a minute. Not to confuse you, but this graph is actually meant to show you how complicated this is. And when we say we're collecting sightings reports from the public, people just think, why do I bother? Because we use those in lots of different parts. So when we collect sighting reports, we're using that to learn about the species distribution more. We're also using it to learn about survival. Sighting reports are the only way we know about tagged bears. So if we tag a bear and then nobody reports it ever again, we don't know the history of that bear. But if a year from now someone reports the next town owner, we know that bear is still alive. We also learn about reproduction. How many times are we seeing bears with lots of cubs, or bears with cubs in certain areas? So things like our necropsies. We learn from our necropsies, we learn about their distribution, their reproduction, their survival. We're using these methods to learn more about each one of those things, and it's not a one-for-one thing. So when we're out there trapping, we're out there doing a necropsy or collecting sightings, we're kind of getting information, bits and pieces that are going into learning more about these goals, which help us establish that index. I'm going to kind of go through each one of those broad things, the methods, to show kind of how we're using it and what we're learning. Let me ask you though, who has submitted a sighting report to the DEP before? A couple. All right, I'm not surprised because Cornwall has relatively few sighting reports entered to us at all, so I'm not surprised that very few of you in here have sent them in. Part of the reason is maybe not many of you know what they're used for, or you're not sure if it's going to be used for the bear's well-being or one way or the other. Is it helpful anymore? I see them all the time, that kind of thing. So we use these sighting reports for lots of different things. Collecting general sightings, If you see a dead bear on the side of the road, that's how you can submit a report to us, and we're going to collect it and study it. That's how you can submit a conflict that you've had. If you had an encounter with a bear or got into your trash, if it got into your home, if it caused structural damage trying to get into your shed or something, this is where you can report those things to us. Every report gets eyes on it. You're not going to get a call back unless there's a real incident, a real thing, but it's still information that we are going to look over every single report that we get. That's also where you can put in information about the ear tags that you saw on the bear, whether it had a collar, whether it had cubs. Last year alone, we had over 8,000 reports sent in to us. That's following a pretty big increasing trend. But the perception of sighting reports often is, oh, if you report the bear, Deep's going to come and kill it. Or, I reported this bear and Deep didn't do anything about it. You can tell from, again, that graph earlier, these far-flung perspectives of what we do. And now you guys can see what we actually are using these sighting reports for and how they relate to our different research goals. I mentioned the ear tags. What's the deal with them? How many of you think that if a bear has ear tags, it's a problem bear, or it's been caused problems before? Okay, good. So that's shifting. All bears that we handle, whether it be getting it out of a very densely populated urban area, whether it be maybe a conflict site, maybe it wasn't the bear that caused the conflict, or most often they're yearlings that are tagged in their second year when we visit the female that has a collar on it. We can go to those den sites. So you'll see bears tagged all over the place. But for most of them are going to be in the northwestern part of the state, because our office is in Burlington, and that's where most of the bears are. A lot of them are in areas that we've been doing research in already, so parts of the Farmington Valley, Heartland, Barkhamsted, Winchester, those areas where we've been doing more research for a longer period of time. There's just more bears there that we've put our hands on and put tags on. The color of the tag is just as indicative of the year that we tagged them and what we had in stock. So this year, there were red tags. Last year, they were pink. And the number, so this bear, green tag, says CT 139. This bear was the 13th bear tagged in 2019. So that's what kind of the number corresponds to the last digit of the year, and then the order that the bear was tagged that year. The bear is sedated at this time.
So the tags are always in both ears?
Both ears, yep. Sometimes you'll see a bear that has one tag. Sometimes you'll see a bear, there's a backing to these tags too that we also put a number on. And bears move through the brush, they move through habitat, they get in fights with each other, and tags come off. So they're cattle tags. They're not meant for bears necessarily, but they're used just as well. But over time, they can fall out, or the marker wears off. But they always get 2 tags, 1 in each ear, when they are handled by us. So here's the use of our sighting reports. We're able to map the range expansion of black bears in Connecticut. So you might be in an area where, we don't bother reporting them anymore. All right, I'm looking at the northwest corner here, right? We know there's bears there. Not many people are reporting them as much. It's not ruining our research, but it's helpful when people do report them. It doesn't tell us that there's no bears here. We know there's bears there, but you can see kind of the leading edge as the number of reports as bears expand their range and are a newer, novel thing to people, or where they're causing more problems, or where they're just being seen more. That is expanding south into more into Fairfield and New Haven County, and some more growth in eastern Connecticut. Question for you then. We're still seeing, after 20 plus years, way more bears in western Connecticut than eastern Connecticut. Do you think that there's less habitat in eastern Connecticut? Or the same? Or raise your hand if you think western Connecticut just has better habitat.
I thought they just got dropped off here. That's the local legend.
That what?
They just get dropped off here.
Where are they getting dropped off from? They've been here.
From other parts of Connecticut and Mass.
No. So I'll talk.
On the road by Music Mountain. That's where there's tons of them there.
Because there's good habitat there.
There is good habitat.
So I'm going to talk about the relocation thing is another thing I'm going to talk about. But in general, there's good habitat. I'm going to show you a map that we've been able to develop through the use of some of our telemetry collars to learn about what types of habitats bears are using most. So we're able to track bears. This is one of our bear collars. Currently we have these on about 20 adult female bears. Mostly they're in that group of towns I mentioned before, Farmington Valley, and a little bit west of that, where we've had long-term research going on bears that are in that area. And we're able to track them through wherever they're living, learn about what types of habitats they're moving through, and we overlay their GPS points over maps of habitat to learn what types of habitats they're favoring. These are, we've got the battery pack down here and the GPS receiver here. These get refitted kind of every year. They do get refitted every year. And they transmit a unique radio signal so that we can actually, in real time, go and find out where they are using kind of the amplitude of the beeps that we're getting back from them. The GPS data, it's not instantaneous. We can't just plug it in and know exactly where the bear is at all times, but we get points at defined intervals.
So that's how you retag them?
So we can go to where the females are denning, for example, when they're just sleeping in their dens, using the radio signal that we're getting to pinpoint exactly, under what tree or what mountain laurel they're denning in. Yeah. So it's a unique frequency for each collar.
Excuse me, when you find them in the den, do you take them out and refit the collar and put them back?
Yep, I'll have a slide on more on that. Yep. Is there a way to clear the?
Yeah, just go to annotations.
Okay. Yeah. Good. Close. Is there a way to?
Are you ready?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There you go. I think people can still do it. Let me go back here. Okay. So we're able to use the telemetry data on our collared sows. Over time, we've got about 20 right now, but over time that data set is over 20 years, or about almost 20 years old. We've got 20 years worth of data on a lot of these sows to find out what their preferred habitat is for a reproducing population. And then we're able to model what made suitable habitat for this set of reproducing bears and look for where that is throughout the state. And we're able to see that most of the state is either suitable or optimal habitat. Besides kind of that central Connecticut River Valley area with a lot of development or agriculture, most of Connecticut is suitable habitat, in some level suitable habitat. The breeding range is still limited to where we kind of see most of our adult females, which is the northwestern part of the state, the northwestern quarter. But we should expect the range of population to continue growing and expanding into that suitable habitat elsewhere in Connecticut. So to answer that earlier question about carrying capacity, we're definitely not statewide at biological carrying capacity. There's a lot of room for the population to continue growing. There could be 2 to 3 times as many bears as the habitat continues to get utilized more across the state. And one other thing I'll say about this too is some of these areas are considered poor habitat, but if the bear's range extends beyond that, they can easily utilize poor habitat where it might have 1 or 2 or 3 of those habitat variables, but most of their range is still in an area where there is suitable habitat. So you might see a lot of areas that kind of are near a lot of suburban areas, that are marked as poor habitat, but I still see a lot of bears there. It's because there's some element of still suitability nearby for them. Our reproducing population, this is our reports of sows with offspring just from the last year. And as I mentioned early on, we consider the reproducing population to be where there's reproduction happening. So wherever we're getting reports of sows and offspring, it's typically still concentrated in the northwestern part of the state. but that expansion is picking up. Over the last 4 years, we've had reports of sows with offspring go from 60 different towns with reports now to 97 towns of 169 in Connecticut. So sows and cubs and offspring are being seen in many, many more towns throughout the state, so that breeding population continues to expand. Why does it expand slower though than where we see males overall when we look at that map of overall bear sightings? Because females often overlap with other females, especially ones that they're related to. When a young female disperses from her mother, she may not disperse all very far away. She may even have some overlap. The mother may tolerate that young adolescent female or adult female eventually overlapping in some of her range, where the young males tend to disperse a lot farther and wander around. So the range is slowly expanding. It's slower than what we might see in overall sightings. That's just because of some of the biology of how the females behave with each other. Getting to those winter den visits, we use the collars to follow, to find out where the sows are denning. When we get to the den, we sedate them with sedative, most often with a jab stick or a dart gun. Once they're down, we assess her body condition, we weigh her, we refit the collar, so we'll pull her out of the den. And you can see from these pictures here, I mean, this on the bottom right is kind of a rock den, but very often it's something as simple as digging out a little bit of a nest bowl at the base of a tree in some mountain laurels, and that's all she'll need. When we move them and we are doing that assessment of her body condition and so forth, we're going to look at what offspring she has, if she had offspring, how big is the litter size, if it's a yearling den, so if we're visiting this bear the year after she had cubs, how many of those yearlings have survived and are with her in the area again the following year. We're learning about the den type, so if we want to know about what makes suitable habitat or denning areas, we need to know what type of habitat they're in or what they're using. When we handle cubs, so the young cubs, we do not put ear tags in the young cubs at that point. What they get though is they get a pit tag. So the pit tag is really just that microchip you would put in your pet. So every bear we handle also gets one of those, a pit tag. So you can see it's being put in here on the right side, and then on the left side, this bear is being scanned. Bear sedated, and it's being scanned to see if it's been handled before. Other states also use pit tags, so if a bear comes into Connecticut and gets hit by a car, we'll scan every bear too to see if it traveled in here from New York or something and didn't have ear tags. The second winter, so as yearlings, when we handle those cubs or yearlings down, you also get sedated, they're going to be big enough, and that's when they'll get their nice set of shiny ear tags. When we do necropsies, often it's for because of bears that were killed in vehicle strikes. We're going to get somewhat of an assessment on their reproduction, particularly for the females. Okay, but we can look at their reproductive organs and look for placental scars in their uterus to see if they've had any embryos implant in their uterus before. So we're able to assess when we get an adult female bear how many uterine or how many placental scars are there in the bear, so we can kind of get an idea of how old that bear was, or if it had reproduced before, and how much reproduction had it seen. Unfortunately, when bears get struck and killed by vehicles, a lot of them were probably healthy before that happened, so we're able to get a good assessment of what the overall population's body conditions are. For a lot of the bears, most of them are healthy when they get hit. We're able to take a tooth and send that off to a lab to get aged, to see how old the bear is. We're going to take tissue samples and stuff as well. We'll scan for a pit tag, and then we will also look at their stomach contents to get an idea of what was in their stomach at the time they died. And in about 50% of the bear stomachs that we see, there's some human-related foods in them, like birdseed, garbage, stuff like that. We do a lot of these in our lab. We do them for bear, bobcat, and fisher. So every bear, bobcat, and fisher in the state that we can get our hands on that's died, most often it's from roadkill, we will do a full necropsy on it, including getting weight and stuff like that. So Some of the results from all those elements that went into learning about black bear reproduction, we're finding that in Connecticut, the age at first reproduction for females is between 2.5 and 3.5 years old. The cub survival, about 80% of cubs are making it through their first year, and the average litter size is about 2.5 cubs per female. So there's a very high potential for growth. When you compare these numbers to other parts of black bear's range, very big, broad range that black bears have, these numbers are generally higher than what's reported throughout most of their range. It's probably similar to maybe some of the other states around here that have similar habitat, but these numbers are pretty high. In other parts of black bear range, it can take up to 5.5 years for a female to become reproductive. Here, they're reaching reproductive age much sooner.
Why? You mean why?
Well, we have a lot of great habitat. So females are reaching a point where there's plenty of food, they have space, and they can reproduce sooner. Males reach that reproductive age at a similar time, but they often don't get opportunities to breed because of competition with other males. So that often goes to the more dominant larger males. By studying by all those public sighting reports that we're getting about conflicts and stuff, we're able to map out where we're getting most of our conflicts and what types of conflicts they are. This kind of follows a similar pattern to where we're seeing sightings, where we're seeing more conflicts where there's likely more bears. But these aren't exclusive just to the western part of the state. We're seeing problems with the public is having issues with black bears from border to border. And most commonly, they're related to trash and birdseed, or bird feeders in general. You can see that our breakdown of the conflicts, so this is over 5,700 conflicts reported to us over the last 2 years. The vast majority is trash and bird feeders. A lot of our more serious conflicts here, home entries, pets, livestock, beehives, they make up a much smaller proportion of the conflicts, but those are also following an increasing trend over the last number of years. And when I talk about birdseed, I don't just mean the black oil, sunflower seed, and the suet. Oriole feeders, hummingbird feeders, all these things are attractive to bears still. Right? It's free, easy calories. And yes, it's cute, but I hope most of you also see this and go, oh, those young bears are learning some bad behaviors very early on. They're learning how to find this human-related food. The mother is so conditioned to seeking out these food sources and is teaching the cubs to find this stuff. So I hope that's kind of the takeaway, as cute as it is to see them. And this map here, I think, is another good example, because often we get a little bogged down in what's happening in this town versus the neighboring town. And this one hardly has any conflicts, or you go back to that other conflict map, and there's some towns with no conflicts reported. It's less about town by town, and just look across Connecticut regionally as we cluster a lot of the bird feeder issues that we have. Bird feeders are causing problems from the far corners of Greenwich, way up to the northwest corner, and all the way to the Rhode Island border. Bird feeders are causing problems with bears. People are reporting issues with bears related to bird feeders everywhere. So it's a big problem. I mentioned, though, that those serious conflicts are also increasing. What we find is a lot of the bears, most bears, if they're broken into homes, they've gotten into trash before, they've gotten into bird feeders before. There's a level of progressive behavior that starts with finding bird feeders, finding trash, becoming habituated, you probably hear us say that word a lot, habituated to being around homes, getting food conditioned around homes, finding those human-related foods, where the next progression is breaking through that screen door to get to the kitchen trash, to get to the kitchen pantry. And so our serious conflicts have also increased over the last number of years. And so far this year, we've already had about 40 home entries. It surpasses last year and will likely surpass 2020. So this is an alarming trend we're finding. More bears are bold enough and habituated enough that they're going into homes more and more often and in more towns. And so we need to be, residents need to be more aware of this. They need to take action to prevent bears from coming into their homes. But again, keep in mind that it's that progressive behavior that we're pretty concerned about over time of bears, habituating to all this human-related food. I mentioned I've talked about in depth now, what is the most common attractants? We call them attractants. The majority is related to easily accessible foods from us. So solving that depends on us as members of the public, individuals, to prevent those things from being accessible. And that's the best way to reduce conflicts with black bears throughout the state. All right, it's not one action by biologists and state agency. It's managing our own trash, not having our own bird feeders out, and that will eliminate 2/3 of all of the black bear conflicts that we have. Other things that lead to conflicts, off-leash dogs lead to more conflicts, especially in areas where they're required to be on leash in the woods or in leashes that are just too long. Or if your dog is, for the most part, uncontrolled. This time of year, the barbecue season is when we do see lots of other conflicts as well. Bears trying to get in, investigating your grill, getting into compost, things like that. Just being smart about your trash. If you had a picnic, not leaving your food sitting out or not leaving the garbage out too much like that. Those are all things that are going to attract not only bears, but anything that's interested in free food, raccoons, stuff like that. So just being smart about all that. Some other things that someone highlighted it for me, is feeding ordinances. So these simple human actions, right, not feeding, sometimes it might take the locals in an area to decide that we need to have some policy to reduce incidences of feeding bears, intentional or unintentional, and feeding ordinances is one way to do it. They all will need community buy-in though to work, because people are still going to do what they want to do. And so a lot of that still requires buy-in, whether you have an ordinance or not. This is just a map of municipalities in Connecticut that have enacted feeding ordinances against feeding dangerous wildlife. Salisbury is the closest neighbor to you guys in Cornwall that just enacted it, or just passed it. But for the most part, you can see most of the towns that have passed these things are the towns that have had bear problems for the most number of years.
Well, does that mean no bird feeders? Are people actually feeding bears by hand? I mean, putting food out for them?
We've had some instances where people are intentionally having food out for bears. Trying to.
It's not about bird feeders, which is also
about bird feeders in these, for the most part, in all these ordinances, bird feeding is prohibited between April and the end of November.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and how those are enforced is up to the towns. How all that stuff is up to the language in the ordinance. But for the most part, these towns are trying to do something to discourage people from having them out. And for some people, all it takes is going, all right, I know they're serious about it. They passed this. I'll take my bird feeder in. Whatever.
There's a fine or something that you're talking about.
For a lot of these, there is a fine, there's a warning, then there's a fine associated, and then it can increase in subsequent infractions. But there's still going to be people who will just do what they want to do anyway. So most of these, as you can see, were enacted fairly recently. So as far as effectiveness and learning about the long-term effects of those things is still not known yet. And also, bears travel between towns. So it's hard to necessarily be able to compare one town to the next when you have bears that are living in both towns. All right. Try to speed up a little bit for us, sorry. As I mentioned, some of our conflicts are more serious, but our response to those conflicts follows guidelines. We have guidelines and protocols set up for all grades of our conflicts, from trash and bird feeders all the way through more serious things like livestock depredation and home entries and injury of people. So we have guidelines that we follow. So there's really never a time where something's going to happen and people just, with some authority, react and make a decision. Everything goes through the bureaucracy of making these decisions of how to react or how to respond to some of these conflicts. A lot of them, though, depend on the owner or the resident to cooperate to prevent something from happening again. We're not going to use our resources to do something like set a trap if the owner of the property isn't going to remove their bird feeder. We're not going to waste our time doing that if they're not going to meet us halfway and do what they need to do. Some of these more serious conflicts do warrant us setting up a live trap as a culvert trap, and a situation like this, a bear would come into the trap lured by donuts that are at the far end. When it pulls down on the cage of donuts, the door shuts, the bear's trapped inside. We respond very quickly, sedate the bear, bring it out, give the workup I mentioned before. And for the most part, for conflicts, most of the conflicts that we set these traps for, things like causing severe structural damage or trying to get into a home, it's hard to know if you've got the offending bear. When we release the bear, we wait for it to be fully awake again, so it knows what's about to happen to it. When we release it, we don't relocate bears, with a couple of weird exceptions I'm going to elaborate on because I think it's important too. But for the most part, we release the bears on site. The reason we do that is because we give them what's called aversive conditioning. We haze them. We will, as they are released back into the into wherever they were, we're going to use air horns. We're going to shoot them with paintball guns. Things to make that experience at that property where they were causing problems negative. All right. So that's what they're released on site. We wouldn't want to move them somewhere and then haze them because they're not associating that treatment with where they were causing that problem. So we don't relocate bears. There might be some examples of if a bear gets into a very developed urban area where the bear needs to get moved to the nearest suitable habitat. Often that's just within a mile or two. It's hard to go anywhere in Connecticut, even in downtown Hartford, there's suitable habitat within a mile or so of that. So bears aren't being moved across the state. If they're being moved to an area of the nearest suitable habitat, or where it's safe to release them nearby. So if the bear's on a very busy road, it causes conflict there, we're not going to release the bear right out on the busy road. You might move it a mile or so to the nearest suitable habitat area. That's still that same area. So we're not moving bears from one part of the state to the next. It's never happened. Out in western states where they have vast wildernesses of state-owned land, the state agency could move a troublesome bear to some area in the wilderness and hope they never see it again. There's no place like that in Connecticut. There's no way we're moving bears from one town to the next. It's just going to be a problem for us in that town. So it's going to, and it's probably just going to travel right back anyway. Bears have a very strong homing instinct. So we don't relocate bears. That's always been a weird myth that we're moving bears from one corner of the state to the next and stocking them in the northwest corner and stuff. There's just, bears have always been here. And this is really the source population, the important part of the population, and they're dispersing out. So again, bear that gets into an urban area, people are crowding all around it, the bear hides in a tree, we might have to sedate it and bring it to the nearest suitable habitat. That's pretty much the only time you'll see any relocation happen in Connecticut. If a conflict is serious enough, that causes injury to a person, kills protected livestock, breaks through electric fencing and does serious damage, or is repeatedly entering homes, that can warrant removal, euthanasia of the bear. But again, all those things are following well-established guidelines and grades of conflicts that take place. And on average, that's like 2 bears a year. 2 to 4 are euthanized by the DEP. Other times, bears are shot by police in response to a public safety threat, countering a bear in a home, things like that. So overall, very few bears are killed by people for any reason in Connecticut. That number the number's not usually out there, but the idea is overblown that bears are being killed just for doing little things and things like that. If you are a lover of the bears, you can probably understand how bears that are doing really dangerous things is a bad look for all bears. And they're a bad example for all bears. And so we have to be able to think about more the population rather than just individuals. And address those reasons why that bear may have gotten into those problem behaviors in the first place.
Does a homeowner ever really have the right to shoot bear?
Yeah, if you, but it's got to be our context, and they'll always be investigated. if you feel a direct threat to you, where you are, say, trapped, not that you went outside and instigated something because you were mad at it, but if you were inside your home, or something like that, and you feel that your life or serious injury were to occur if you did not intervene, then yeah, I mean, it's not like, this general comment, just about anything. If someone enters your home and you feel that threat, you probably will do something like that. With livestock and stuff, if you are trying to stop an active depredation on your livestock, you could shoot a bear. But for the most part, those things don't happen very often. When they do, they're in the news.
Well, that's the reason I asked, because of that.
Yeah. So the best thing when we say to prevent conflicts, especially those serious conflicts, is to use electric fencing. And I'm going to harp on this for a couple slides because it's one of these emerging things where we're seeing more and more problems. Part of it is because a lot of people got into owning chickens during the pandemic. And 85% of all of our livestock conflicts involve backyard chickens that are unprotected or not protected properly. So when it's maintained and installed correctly, electric fencing is going to be 100% effective at preventing issues with black bears. And if you do it properly, it can prevent all your issues with coyotes and bobcats and other things that are going to be going after your livestock. Electric fencing, ordinary fences just won't work. You might get by just having some wire fence around your chicken coop. You might get by for years. Eventually, bear's going to get into it, and it's going to cost you. So you need to prioritize it from day one. It should be part of your plan when you bring in a coop and bring in chickens to your house or your property. You're going to be a livestock owner. Electric fencing should be in the plan from day one. It's the most cost-effective way to protect your livestock. Apiaries, trash, gardens. I mean, there's so many different ways that you can set up electric fencing to keep bears out of your backyard in general, or out of things that cost a lot of money to set up. The cost of losing a hive of bees versus the cost of setting up an electric fence. Roughly, it's going to cost about $400, as a one-time startup for an electric fence to protect something like beehives. One thing that we need to make sure of, though, when you get an electric fence is that it meets these minimums for bears. A lot of what you might find at a Tractor Supply in the store might not be the right equipment. The big thing is on the energizer. The energizer, whether it's a solar energizer or an AC one, needs to have 0.7 joules of output delivered. That's the big thing. If it's too weak, it won't deliver the shock it needs to give. They also need to be at least 4 feet high and have at least 4 to 5 wires, ranging 8 inches apart, and the lowest one should be 8 inches off the ground. Another important thing is that they need to be spaced far enough away from what they're protecting. We've seen a number of people send us pictures of their setups after a bear got into it, like destroyed their beehives, and the bear simply had to reach over the fence and pull down the frames of beehives, or reach in and grab chickens. So you need to make sure your fence is at least 4 or 5 feet away from whatever you're going to protect as well. These are the basic components, and we can provide information like this if you reach out to us, if you have questions about electric fencing. But this basic setup costs $400. A couple, again, some of the important things about it, making sure it's properly grounded, all these things are important, because if any one of those things isn't done properly or fails or it's not grounded right, it's not going to be effective, and it's just a wire fence. So that's often where you see people have problems with electric fencing where, oh, why didn't it stop the bear? Because something here wasn't set up properly or it wasn't rated to be a strong enough energizer. Just quickly looking online, they have specific bear kits that you can get. You can also get the netting. Roughly $400 there for that setup there. It's important to take that time to prevent the conflicts from happening so you don't end up with the loss of livestock that you care about, or all the financial damage or structural damage to a coop, things like that. I'm going to kind of wrap up, and I'm going to hit the topic of hunting in a minute. But the big take-homes I want for you guys are the thoughts of what makes good habits of coexistence with any wildlife, but in particular bears. Removing those bird feeders, keeping pets under control, securing your waste. Some towns are offering bear-proof, or some trash haulers are offering bear-resistant carts. If you are in a town that doesn't offer those, then you can try to talk to the town about encouraging trash haulers to have those things. Don't leave pet food outside. That's an attractant, not just for the stray cats, but also the coyotes and the bears and everything else. Protect those things with livestock and educate your neighbors. Your real neighbors in Cornwall, your online neighbors everywhere that think they have all the answers. Help to educate people so they can understand what we're actually doing with our bears and how the best ways to coexist are. So I talked about that population management early on, different ways to manage population towards its goals. Hunting and trapping is a tool that wildlife managers can use. Hunting does provide a sustainable natural resource when it follows science. But hunting is not a silver bullet. It's not going to stop all the conflicts. You still see conflicts happening in states that allow hunting. So looking at this map, we're seeing almost every state that has a population of bears has either stable or expanding populations. Which states do you think have hunting, bear hunting?
Pennsylvania.
Jersey.
Jersey? Do you think any of those don't have hunting?
Us.
Connecticut.
And Rhode Island.
Rhode Island, yeah, and they don't really have reproducing bear populations, so that's why they're in green. So for the most part, though, we can take away from this, most bear populations are stable, or the majority are increasing throughout the Northeast. All right. You also think which states maybe prohibit bear feeding of bears, and for the most part, most states prohibit intentional feeding of bears. All other states that I showed up there, except Connecticut, allow bear hunting. New Jersey kind of fluctuates with some things year to year. So this data is from 2019, the Eastern Bear Working Group. But the average harvest for black bears in those states with hunting is between 5 and 20% of the population every year. So a lot of bears can be harvested, and those populations can still increase and can stay stable within their population means. A lot of bears are coming in these states where there's stable populations. Those are the population numbers that they're trying to maintain. Right? So there's lots of bears even in those stable populations. Yeah. So that allows a lot. Populations can handle 5 to 20% of harvest and still be stable and increasing. So if you see lots of this back and forth about when's the state going to allow bear hunting and, oh, it's only a matter of time before this and that, you've got to sort of temper the two sides of this argument and realize hunting bears is done in most other states. Hunting bears does not stop the population from continuing to grow. As I mentioned earlier, we have a lot of habitat. If there were to be ever a bear hunting season in Connecticut, we should still expect the population to increase, both in range and in size, because that's what happened in other states, and we have a lot of suitable habitat. Hunting bears, though, does not stop all conflicts. Bears that are most habituated, though, tend to be more likely to be harvested in other states they've found, so that is one way that having bear hunting can reduce some conflicts with black bears, depending on how the hunt is conducted. But it's one tool, just like prohibiting feeding of wildlife. Ordinances is another tool, one of many tools that we use, or that wildlife managers try to use to manage a population. It's not the only way, it's one of many tools. In Connecticut right now, that hunting isn't a tool that's available to us, and neither is a statewide feeding ordinance. So those are things that don't come from DEEP, those come from our legislative body. So again, when you see things online about, oh, why isn't DEEP allowing this, DEEP is doing this, that's, a lot of the times it's out of DEEP's control. We're just here to manage with the tools that we have. Wrapping things up, are bears dangerous? Many people have had experiences with bears. They think they're very cute and this and that. They are cool, wild animals, but they still are large, wild animals. They have the potential to be very dangerous. They can be dangerous. Habituated and food conditioned bears are linked to more dangerous behavior. So we have all these problems with habituated bears all around us. When there has been issues with bears, with dangerous interactions and dangerous behaviors, it's most often associated with habituated bears. We can see that problem, how it would play out because a lot of our bears in Connecticut are habituated. So there's a lot of potential for there to be issues. Having said that, though, aggressive encounters are extremely rare throughout black bear's range, and particularly in Connecticut. Most predatory bear attacks occur in a wilderness setting. They don't occur in suburban areas. Most attacks occur in regions where there are already hunting seasons for bears. And the injuries inflicted during these bear-dog, most injuries are inflicted during bear-dog confrontations when we've seen things like this. So, kind of trying to give you, both ends of it. They are dangerous wild animals. We need to respect them. We can appreciate that they're here and that they're doing well. We don't need to live in fear and think that we're going to just people are going to get killed and all this stuff. And that hunting is going to solve everything. I've seen both sides, hopefully. The key takeaways. I hope every one of you can answer these questions now. You know what ear tags mean. You know when we give bears ear tags, why we give bears ear tags. You know whether our population is overpopulated or whether we're building, and there's no habitat left for them. We know there's a lot of habitat. We know what leads to most of our human-bear conflicts. We now know why bears don't get relocated after causing a problem. I've mentioned why Western Connecticut tends to have more conflict than Eastern Connecticut. That's where our reproducing population is. And the overall population number. We see that, we try to have people asking for that all the time. Why is that not as important to us? And then the status of bears and hunting laws in other states. So you have a little bit more perspective and hopefully a little bit more understanding about what the role hunting plays in wildlife management overall. It's not to destroy animals. So I'm going to give you a little information if you can take a picture of this. So if you have questions about wildlife in general, you can call us at the top number. You can also email us. If you have questions specifically about bears, it's probably easier to just email. And reach out to us, especially with things like electric fencing and stuff like that. Connecticut is now part of Bearwise, which is an organization that other state agencies have also joined, and they have a lot of resources for coexisting with black bears. I have some Bearwise information that you guys can take with you: door hang tags, some stickers, put on your trash cans. What's that?
For the bears.
Well, for your neighbor. If you know your neighbor's feeding, if your neighbor's got their bird feeders up, maybe just stick that on their doorknob. All right, if you want to sort of take a pledge to, stash your trash until trash day, put the sticker on your trash can to remind yourself. We've got some magnets, with a couple other tips for this. And this book, Living with Black Bears, is a decent resource if you want to learn more about reading about what it's like to live in areas with bears. Which we do. And if you find other information from state agencies on their websites about living with black bears, a lot of that information is going to be very similar. So a lot of state agencies around, we're going to have a lot of the same information, dealing with a lot of the same things. If you have an emergency related to bears, bears in your home or things like that, this is the emergency NCON dispatch number. So if you have a bear emergency, that's the number you would call to get NCON to respond to a real emergency. Right, not eating your trash kind of thing. All right, any questions? Great, we'll start right here.
Do they have you were talking about the territories, like we have at least 3 or 4 different bears that, habitually come, but they're obviously different bears.
Yep.
So they do cohabitate that way? Or I thought bears kind of were individual and didn't, you know what I mean? Get out of my turf.
Oftentimes related bears and subadult bears may kind of have some overlapping range, particularly a mother and her offspring. Even adult offspring, may have some overlap in that range. Subadult bears wander around, so the yearlings, as they disperse, they may, you may have seen one in your yard, but then 2 days later, it's, in Granville, Massachusetts. The young wandering male bears, they're all over the place. So, you just may see it, but then the male bears, that, they can be more territorial, particularly during that breeding season where they're kind of trying to be around all the females in this area. So, generally they're solitary, except when they have young or during breeding time, and if they're related, they might be more tolerant to each other.
So they're just being tolerant to get the prize.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask about dogs. Like many of us, I'm sure, have dogs, and we're in the country and a big yard and woods and all that. if a dog is out in your yard and barking, is that going to deter a bear? I kind of have a feeling that the bears don't want to be barked at by a dog.
They likely don't, but a bear might get used to the sound of a dog barking, especially if it knows, if it passes, follows a game trail through the woods and the dog's picking up on it every day, it's going to get used to it. Likely they're going to get used to it.
But if you think there's a bear around, like you want to make sure to get your dog back in the house?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Get it under control in some way. Put it on a leash. Have control of it, because if that bear happens to still wander through the yard, you probably don't want an interaction between the two.
But will a bear attack a dog?
It likely won't just go
That's
after
what I
a
thought,
dog,
right.
but a dog will go after a bear.
Yeah.
And that's where probably the issues occur, because
Yeah.
you know, if a dog is after you, so you got to defend yourself. And if there's cubs around, the females aren't going to be like a vicious grizzly, but the cubs are going to go up a tree, and if the dog doesn't yield and back down, the female's going to still protect itself. It may go up a tree too.
The other quick question I had is there any way to tell males from females except by size when you're looking at bears? Or they just look the same?
Well, unless the female, you can see mammary glands on it.
Okay.
If it's nursing. Size, if it's a very, very big guy, it's going to be very, very big.
Okay.
During the breeding season, you might see that slightly bigger bear following the slightly smaller bear. The males also might have a little bit of a cowboy walk as they're following the females around. Often if they're urinating on their legs or urinating around and stuff, and they're ready to go.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So, yes.
So there have been a couple of injured bears, adults, in the area, and as animal control, a lot of times people call me. And there's nothing that can be done. Nobody's going to help them. My gut instinct is to just let nature take its course, because I know at least one injured bear, I think it was up in Canaan, was seen the next year with her cubs and doing well. But my only thought was, are they more of a danger? And is that something that should be worried about?
So the first part, yeah, we don't do anything if there's
Right,
an
I
injured
know, there's
adult bear.
nothing to
They
be
are
done.
very resilient. Like you said, reports that we've seen bears that, for whatever reason, might have lost part of a limb. Or
Yeah,
used
this
a
one
limb.
lost.
And they get by just fine. They can still reproduce and all that stuff. So they recover from a lot. And whether it's a male, whether they're fighting and injured that way or getting hit by a car, some of them do survive. I wouldn't say they're any more dangerous, but just as with any bear, with any wild animal, it's unpredictable. You shouldn't be approaching it, you shouldn't harass it. They need to be a little more less receptive to being harassed by people and might do things like, huff more off from a closer distance or something like that. But generally, it's not going to be.
Just want to make sure I was on the right track.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can you explain why some states may have where it's legal to feed a bear? What's the point of feeding a bear?
I don't know why we're baiting necessarily. People will. So there is some for hunting. There's and that often that's still often different bear baiting because that has a dedicated season. In some states you can. Some states that do have bear hunting, not every state that has bear hunting, it will allow baiting of bears for a short period of time preceding the hunting season, where that's kind of the general thought is that you're going to lure the most habituated bears to that area, and then you'll be able to harvest the one that you're allotted.
But is that different from feeding?
It's different than feeding bears. Some states they don't have so much of the problems, or where it's not like passing it, or it can get dicey with different things like agriculture and stuff. So I don't have the exact answer to why a particular state hasn't passed it.
Has so many bears, and we think they would have problems if any state does, but they don't have a law against feeding.
They don't have a law against intentional feeding of bears yet. People are so sparsely, besides some of those more developed areas, most of Maine is just wilderness, or very undeveloped areas, so they don't have a lot of the same problems. like remember from some of those maps, most of those problems are where there's lots of people, lots of trash, lots of bird feeders. In Maine and some of those other more rural states just don't have the density of people to cause those problems.
Connecticut has the density of both bears and people. They don't have the law. It's just strange.
It's strange that
That they
Connecticut,
don't have, that it's legal to feed bears in Connecticut.
it is strange.
Or is it more that it just,
New to us.
It's not
right, it's
relatively
not
new.
illegal, it's not wise, but they just haven't.
So
Part of the outlaw.
because
Right.
the conflicts that we see with bears, while they are border to border, the majority of the problems are still located in the northern part of the state. So the public in those other towns are less motivated to get their legislators to pass something like that, or just less knowledgeable about the long-term issues of habituation. So it takes time for people to learn as well. Is there, yeah, you can.
Where is it that we make, if we have a sighting, who do we contact?
If you Google, Connecticut DEP black bears or something, anything like that, you'll find on our webpage information about to see where sighting reports have been sent in this year. We have a map of public sightings, but there'll be a sighting report link on the website. So if you just Google it, it'll come up.
Okay.
Yeah.
What is the cause of mortality of the cubs in that first year?
It's sometimes hard to say. Sometimes it is car accidents. That's one that, because it's on the road, people will see it, and that's one that we know about. Other times they just don't survive. Animals still get sick and die and things like that. This tends to be, in other parts of the bear's range, there can be some predation from other animals, and that could happen in Connecticut still with things like coyotes or something like that from a very young bear. But that's one reason why it's so low. Why mortality is so low and cub survivorship is so high.
Kyle, we're going to have Margaret give us a few from
Okay.
Zoom.
Yep.
So it's one big question, really. The proper response when you encounter a bear. This one woman writes that she had a bear 6 to 8 feet from her, so she raised her hands and clapped and prayed. Was that the right response, is the question.
She could use her voice. Well, she could pray out loud. That's what she feels like she has to do. So yeah, you don't want to allow bears to get so comfortable being close to you or being really near your homes and doing stuff. If the bear is just passing through your yard, enjoy the sighting. If the bear is snooping around, trying to get onto your deck, looking for things in the trash, show that bear. That's it for this one. Show that bear it doesn't belong there. So yell at it, from a safe distance or from inside your window. Yell at it. You can do the pots and pans thing. Don't make it comfortable. If you're out in your backyard gardening or something and the bear happens to meander by, you're not in danger. But make sure you can get yourself inside or towards the house. Be vocal. Let it know. You want to. Scaring bears is totally fine. Scare them away. You throw a tennis ball at them. Make it know that it needs to also respect us as much as we need to be respecting them. Is there another one online or?
Most of the questions were about bear encounters, so we can probably take one or two more questions.
Okay, I'll just tack on to that though. If you are out in the woods and you're hiking and you encounter some bears, odds are they're going to run away from you. Even if there's cubs or something, they'll probably go up into the tree. The sow might hang around, but they're not going to go after you. But make sure that you are still vocal. Don't sneak up on a bear. Don't turn and run from a bear as well. Like I said, a lot of the bears that are going to be curious, are most likely going to be the younger adolescent bears that are all wandering around. And if you run from one, it may get curious and chase after you. So never run from a bear or any carnivore, coyotes, bobcats, into that. Be vocal and stand your ground. And if in the event, this is such a rare thing throughout bear's range, a bear is pursuing you or coming after you, be aggressive and fight back. Don't play dead. Be aggressive and you can yell at it, chase it, show it that you're not something to be pursued. Yeah.
What's the life expectancy of a bear without getting hit by a car or something?
So the long end, there's one of our research bears has had a collar for over 20-something years, and she was already an adult at the time. So she's over 25 years old. I think in other parts of the U.S. that some reports of some wild bears being in the 30s. In Connecticut, the average is probably, well, at least 7. Yeah, bears get hit, they still have diseases, they die, and there's lots of ways that, just like us, we can all die from a lot of different things. So it's not just cars. So. Yep.
I have a comment and then a question.
Okay.
And the comment is based on what I'm seeing this year. Where I live, it abuts state land. You've reached your biological capacity. Okay. And now the question is about the cultural capacity. And I can see how that varies within a town itself.
Yep.
And where we live, practically every day, we hear bears, and we see bears on our video cameras. And the point is that at a certain point, you just know that it's going to lead to some bad incident. And it also affects the quality of life within the community, because when you hear the huff, it creates fear. And children are at play, and you're trying to enjoy the outdoors. And at certain points in the dusk, and not in the morning as much as in the evening, it's a concern. And so that's my comment. I think your estimate of 1,000 to 1,200, based on what I'm seeing, is way low. Okay, and I would say to you that part of the problem may be that the manner by which you're getting people to report it is woefully inadequate. Many people are disincentivized or just now so used to seeing bears that they don't make the effort. And the question is there any other alternative way in which to deal with overpopulation that we right next to state land in the northwest corner see as an issue of overpopulation, where people down in other towns where towards the river may not see the same? It's not necessarily felt by the state. And so the state legislature may have some that feel the issue and others that don't. But the question is, when it comes to population control, is there another way other than culling them? And is that by birth control, by going in and actually treating the females? Because that's what I'm seeing a lot of. Females with their cubs, and from what I'm understanding, they more or less are being chased out by the males. And I've had an incident where I actually had to drag off a female sow who had been hit by a car, only to find out that there were 3 cubs in the tree overlooking the whole incident. So there's a lot of heartbreaking stories where you hear of the mothers being killed or one entering into a home and having been shot, and the cubs are left to fend for themselves, and there's no way they survive. So my question is there a way, as a resident, to go and make my voice heard? Is the state, does it have alternative solutions? I think the electric fence is a great idea. But is there also a way in which to employ the idea of going in and treating the population in the manner which I say is more humane than culling?
So, there's a couple parts to that question. One, I'm going to say, again, our sighting reports, as you said, are woefully inadequate. That's not how we're estimating the population. That's one way that we track, that we collect information from the public. We also don't care too much about that number because it's less informative. As you said, one part of the state does have a lot more bears than the other part. So the overall number isn't as informative. You will always have bears in that area, whether there's hunting or not, because you live in suitable bear habitat. You may not have bears that are as habituated as that. And what I would suggest, besides whatever circumstances are in your house, is make it unpleasant for any bear that comes near that is in your area. Do you have neighbors like close by, or do you have a lot of woods?
A lot of woods. They're off in the distance. I have to say there is one neighbor in particular that has their garbage right alongside.
So no matter whether there is a cull, as you put it, or a reduction, an attempt to reduce the bear population specific in your area, which wouldn't necessarily do anything. If your neighbors are still feeding bears, you are going to have habituated bears around your house all the time. So that is a problem specific to that, and reducing the bear population in the area isn't necessarily going to stop that problem. That's not going to address necessarily that. I would talk to your legislators. That's the best way to kind of help things get more, if you are in favor of allowing DEEP to use hunting as a management tool for black bears. But I'll just tell you again, you are always going to have black bears around you. You live in an area with great habitat. It's just how habituated are they going to be?
But this year is a lot worse than prior.
So 1 year to the next, the population isn't going to, all of a sudden double. You might have bears learning more bad behaviors and spending more time, or there might be more food from a neighbor around. So that's kind of a big thing when we see people 1 year to the next having, like, why is it all of a sudden now? Oh, the neighbor now has a new something, and there's a lot more food around, or they just got a new bird feeder set up, things like that. The reproduction, or the birth control that you mentioned, to my knowledge, I don't know enough about it, I'm not going to answer, but it's not something that's practical or realistic on a large scale and stuff. And states, again, that all of our surrounding states, we're very close to New York and Massachusetts, they have bear hunting, but they still have bears in bear habitat, and if there's feeding that's going on of some sort, intentional or unintentional, you're going to have those problems. And I understand it's frustrating to deal with that. The reason I asked about what's the neighbors around you and stuff like that is, if I've done this for, I don't know, so this is going to work for everybody, and everyone's situations are going to be very different, but I've used a paintball gun to haze bears that are loitering around the house too much. So that habituated behavior, at the point where pots and pans or air horn doesn't do anything, a paintball gun to the bum is enough to give them a negative reason not to keep coming around this area. And eventually, you would paintball every bear's bum around, and they would all know all right, I avoid this area because it's uncomfortable. Got to make sure if you're going to do something like that, that it's safe to do so around your property, obviously. We don't recommend discharging firearms around bears to give a warning shot. That would not be good and smart. But paintball guns, high-powered super soakers kind of thing, anything that's like, okay, this is not uncomfortable hanging around this house anymore. Car alarms, yeah. They get used to noise. It's unfortunate. It's pain that helps. A little, jolt, just like the electric fence jolt, the paintball jolt. But again, that application is very specific, and maybe that would work for your situation in your yard and that kind of thing. I don't know, but you could think about that.
Carla, I think that's a good place to stop because it reminds us that it's not the bears, but we need to train ourselves to be good bear neighbors. So I'm going to let Margaret give us a good night.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting and very important for us to have all the information, and thank you also to all of you who attended here live and also on Zoom. And please remember that the Cornwall Association of Cornwall Library are nonprofits, and we are grateful for contributions. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.